Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Angela Foy Fletcher. I am a licensed marriage-friendly therapist over at Resolve Counseling and Wellness. And today we're going to talk about the ethical considerations for working with diverse clients, specifically around microaggressions and microvalidations. This is as part of the 2023 CARE4U2 conference presentation, and I'm glad you're here to join us. So, a little bit about myself. I have completed a Master's of Science in Child Development and Family Studies with a specialization in marriage and family therapy. So I have also worked in the nonprofit, higher education, as well as human services organizations for over 10 years. So specifically, I work with child welfare agencies, work with foster adoption folks, as well as working with children in the teaching hospital over at Children's Mercy. I'm specifically trained in cultural competency level 1, as well as pursuing a postgraduate training for child-centered play therapy over at the Heartland Play Institute. Currently at Resolve, I am a clinical child and family therapist. And to report, I have no reported financial relationships to disclose at this time. So here at Resolve, we really kind of focus on the mission of reimagining mental health to reduce barriers and improve care. So this is what we set out to do and how we do it, right? Because in order to create this vision of a community in which mental health services are accessible, exceptional, and stigma-free, this presentation is an offering that talks about how we can minimize microaggressions and really maximize opportunities for microvalidations, which is the small intentional efforts to affirm others. And so we value kind of high quality, serve the community, prioritize inclusion, compassion, team care, as well as teamwork, I should say, and continual improvement. So with that being said, this presentation is part of how we can prioritize inclusion so we can create a community in which we discuss how there's an ethical perspective when it comes to microaggressions and to really reduce that when we kind of give care. So during this presentation, we're going to make sure to discuss these 5 highlights. For example, we need to make sure we have the same language, and that relates to having defining microaggression as well as what microvalidation is. We're going to make sure to review the major clinical codes of ethics that's relevant to the importance of addressing microaggressions. So kind of what are the clinical codes for the National Association of Social Work or the National Education Association. Lastly, we're going to make sure to identify strategies. So if a clinician or if someone has engaged in a microaggression, how to demonstrate productive ways in responding to a microaggression, even with our clients, and really just kind of discussing some of the 5 benefits of microvalidations in the therapeutic setting. So I always like to kind of orient ourselves as if we're in the room, because we never know who shows up in the room. And we know that there's a huge population of ethically diverse patients and clients who are seeking opportunities to discuss and really talk about, some of the things they experience in their day-to-day. So for example, microaggressions in the workplace, barriers in care. And so I like to orient ourselves like as if we're in the room. This is actual space at Resolve Counseling, where if you're in the room and you're across the couch with a client, I want you to think about how microaggressions and microvalidations are the opportunities to lean into our curiosity. So specifically, what is microaggression? So according to the American Psychological Association, how we describe microaggression is just this brief everyday exchanges, as you can see here on the slide, that's often, and this is very important, and unintentional and automatic. So again, kind of that sends kind of a negative message to individuals based on their group membership. You can see here examples of race, gender, sexual orientation, and age, disability. What I want you to emphasize is real understanding that microaggressions really are just brief and they're unintentional and automatic, which derives from some biases that are kind of placed from what we were exposed to, what our clients were exposed to. They kind of come up. And because of that, it can kind of create a negative message, unintentionally or unintentional. So then you think about, well, what about microvalidation? I can tell you that micro-invalidation, as we're all therapists and clinicians alike, is like you invalidate someone's experience by minimizing, reducing, discounting someone's experience. So with microvalidation, it's these small yet positive actions that actually encourage or affirm others. So who's in the room? Understanding like, okay, ooh, ouch, X. There was something that happened that was said that felt a little bit ouchy. However, the antidote to that is using a micro-validation, using a small positive action that can encourage others. And we'll talk more about that, what that actually looks like. But first, we're going to get into what microaggression is and the why. So according to the McKinsey reports, which is a phenomenal website that gives up-to-date information, research-based statistics about microaggressions, how to be an ally, understanding the psychological effects of microaggressions. I think just really looking at due to the recent increased hate crimes against specifically Asian Americans since COVID-19 began, they said that there's a 1900% increase. So that's the why. It's happening outside of our room in the to our clients and coming into the room. And how we, and ethically speaking, how do we make sure that living in a society we don't, and as well as not bringing it into the room, because this is happening everywhere. Specifically, we also saw in a different group membership as the sexual orientation and gender identity, LGBTQ women and women with disabilities are more likely to experience demeaning and othering microaggressions. When I say othering, is like being made to feel different, knowing if you're the only one in the room, you're othered out, someone's bringing that out. And so that might be an unintentional thing, but actually it creates this kind of feeling of, as you can see here, some psychological symptoms. Someone may experiencing depressive symptoms, withdrawn, not feeling ready to go to work, right? Getting the Sunday scaries, but going beyond Sunday scaries and going into like, I really don't feel like I can be myself. Anxiety, right? Anxiety is a way to move us to action. However, it can also move us to always being hypervigilant, high alert, right? Always looking out after a microaggression specifically. And then last but not least, the trauma. So some of the somatic experiencing that happens, kind of having trauma reminders of the experience, being made to feel like I am out of control. And so it's really this business perspective as well as the ethical perspective of knowing that these are the symptoms that happen when a microaggression has happened either to you or to the client, and how we have to minimize and do no harm. And I want to kind of make sure we understand that not only is this ethically speaking, according to the National Association of social workers must respectfully observe as well as educate when they bear witness to a microaggression in practice. So again, making sure that there's an ethical perspective in the code of ethics that while it's not overtly saying like here's a microaggression, when a microaggression happens, is what you do. But I think it's interesting that they told us to respectfully observe and educate when you bear witness to one. So let's think about the other kind of associations and educators, as well as like clinicians' ethical responsibility to address that mosquito bite. So again, we're in the room, right? A client may have said something that's kind of ouchy, like a mosquito bite. You're wondering, well, how's a microaggression like a mosquito bite? Well, think about it as this kind of small annoyance that, affects people's mood, can affect kind of like, and it depends on how many people, who gets the most mosquito bites. One is okay, but if it's intentional all the time, 50 of mosquito bites, it can feel kind of unnerving, hard to focus, and also very just frustrating. And so in the room, it's like, how do we minimize, like kind of have our, if you will, our bug spray by addressing and acknowledging if there's a mosquito bite that happens, right? Because ethically speaking, we see here that according to, there's associations on the left side of the table, kind of the code section where it's at, and then the summary. I'll be honest, folks, when I was looking up and recording this, I found that it was difficult for me to find explicit language in the different associations that talked about what happens with a microaggression. So if I, as the educators talked about this, I can only imagine that those in the room had a difficult time, whether it was in your graduate school, when you thumb through inside the, that, I know everyone did that, right? They went outside, they kind of cornered that little area in the book and said, okay, let me know all the ethics about what happens when this happens, all right? But I thought I'd just kind of bring out examples, and it doesn't cover it all, but it gives examples of what they talk about, what their language looks like when it comes to ethical responsibility to addressing microaggressions. So again, the first one is American Association of Marriage Family Therapy, which is this is what I'm part of as a licensed marriage and family therapist. They have in the code section of 1.1 non-discrimination. As you can see here, it talks about how marriage and family therapists provide professional assistance to persons without discrimination on the basis of, again, race, age, ethnicity, and you can see the rest of that. And again, talks about the group membership. Now, I remember microaggressions was talking about, the definition was sharing about how, minimize any negative messages towards a group membership. I'm seeing it in that definition, but it doesn't overtly say microaggressions. We also see in the American Psychological Association, the second box, that the code section of 3.04, avoiding harm. So again, psychologists can take responsible steps to avoiding harm their clients and patients, students. So again, minimizing harm, but does it explicitly say discriminatory acts, microaggression? Not necessarily, but it gives saying like we have to do no harm. And then the last two, you see the National Association of Social Workers in the section of 4.02, discrimination. This is a little bit more explicit, saying should not practice, condone, facilitate, or collaborate with any form of discrimination. Any form could be microaggression, right? Could be harassment, everything like that. But I like that it spells it out. Practicing condoning, whether you're a bystander or upstander, right? About all these other things. And then last but not least, I just want to throw in there for our teachers who is watching this, the National Educator Association has a principle of one, commitment to the student. So again, how do we commit ourselves? How do we have an ethical responsibility to the students we serve? And that's like shall not on the basis of race, even it starts off with the gender, with the group membership, shall not on the basis of race, color, creed, sex, national origin, as well as the others, unfairly, whether exclude any student from participation in any program, deny benefits to the student, or grant any advantage. So again, it kind of talks about the privileges, as well as microaggression, but this is something that we can kind of really think about. So, okay, you're like, all right, I know I have ethical responsibility to not give a microaggression, but what are some examples? So I thought I would give you some examples based around certain themes, what the microaggression is and what the message is. So again, I'll talk more about this thing of intention versus impact, but I just want you to put on the lens of, here's some common themes that we find when there's a certain microaggression that happens. So in the first box you see is a myth of meritocracy. This myth of meritocracy talks about how, an example of a school counselor tells a Latinx student that if you work hard, you can succeed like everyone else. Again, perhaps the school counselor was trying to unintentionally, intentionally trying to convey a message that, having good work ethic, recognizing kind of the value of education, goal setting, all those kind of things can happen anywhere, especially in America. But if we just kind of look at our history and look at the groups, who is excluded, who's included, who has access, who doesn't have access, sometimes that message actually kind of conveys that people of color are lazy and are incompetent and need to work harder. So again, the intention was to share, here you are, like you want to accomplish a goal, you want to make sure that you're regulate your emotions, or you want to be able to become an engineer. Oh, well, you can just work hard like everybody else. Telling that to a student, but not of a Latinx descendant versus someone who isn't, could kind of imply this message that, well, people of color are lazy and are incompetent, so you just need to work a little harder. And it's very dismissive of the experience. Another microaggression, again, and for those of us, this might be the time where you feel a little bit tight, a little clenched right now, like the shirt's too tight, like, uh-oh, I may have said this or I may have witnessed this. I just want you to kind of go into with a non-judgmental attitude. Again, leaning into your curiosity, understand. I wonder what that means. I wonder what that's about. So the second one, pathologizing culture values. This one is talking about how a client of either maybe Asian descent has trouble maintaining eye contact with his therapist. So therefore, that therapist may have diagnosed him with a social anxiety disorder. When really it's like, again, beyond just looking at not really looking at the full picture of that client, and only focusing on, the message of it leaves your cultural baggage outside, leave your cultural baggage outside, not really being considerate, not having the humility to seek to understand versus to understood. Look at leaning to in that curiosity of like, I wonder what makes a client feel that they look low, right? Instead of just pathologizing it. Because we know that, in specific cultures, especially with South Asian descent, Asian descent, that there is kind of like looking at a person in the eyes is a sign of disrespect. And I could be wrong here, right? But again, that's from my own limited knowledge, but I'm not going to make that bias, right? Maybe that's clean, kind of leaning into it and talking more versus just saying, okay, I'm not going to consider that. The last one is color blindness. This one is saying like, oh, I don't see color, right? If you grew up and hear that message, this is a false myth. In order for us to feel protected, regardless or not, our biases tells us there's a mental shortcut. If we're in a dangerous situation, if we're in a situation of fear, our mind typically will go into something of safety. And the first thing we'll see is color of a person, right? Or if you're describing, like if you're a police, if you're not a police officer, but let's say you're a dispatcher and you're sharing with someone over the radio, hey, there's this 5'5" male, looks like this. I've already told the height and the as well as the gender, and I may go into race, right? And color blindness, if someone who's like grew up and saw that, would say like a client of color expresses concern in discussing racial issues with their therapist. And therefore that therapist or counselor or a teacher may say, when I see you, I don't see color. So the client didn't ask if you see me, right? Or there's an assumption made that, oh, well, maybe because you feel like we're different, physically different races, therefore I don't see you. When really kind of saying like, then there's a message like why you're deviant. And again, understanding the themes, what this microaggression can feel like in the message. Just that's the biggest takeaway from here. Some examples, something to consider. So you may be asking yourself like, oh man, I've said these things, or I've saying this and I didn't say anything. Maybe, okay, next time, what can I do differently? Well, the ways to address is obviously we want to be productive and helpful. That's our ethical responsibility into ourselves. We want to be helpful. We want to be able to offer a different response, as well as kind of being an advocate. And so I invite you to kind of think about noticing and responding by trying not to be defensive. This is a hard one, especially if you get asked or told, hey, that's something that kind of hurt my feelings, or even afterwards, a client may come back and say, this interaction made me feel this way. Our primal instinct is to kind of get defensive. No, because it's like, oh man, I made harm. But I want you to take a step back, maybe take a deep breath and say, okay, and notice, right? Notice, okay, I'm feeling defensive. I'm feeling like it's a somatic experience. What can I do, right? That second step of taking stock of your feelings and about your thoughts and behavior. Because in order for us to kind of acknowledge the other person's hurt, be able to apologize and reflect and take responsibility, you have to be able to put the defenses down and take stock of your feelings. It's not to say that, we're in a career where we're going to make mistakes, just like our clients come in and they have they want to kind of work through some issues, work through people who are not in the room, right? That's affecting their day to day. That also applies to us as well. So, of course, we have that ethical responsibility to not be discriminatory, but it can happen. So, especially with ethnically diverse patients, it's important for us to try not to be defensive, kind of take stock of your own feelings, do a check-in, I would say, and say, okay, I'm noticing a little tight. Well, what do I need? What do I need right now, right? Because if there's a rupture, just like with attachment theory, right? If there's a rupture, there can be a repair. And this is opportunity. Using that productive response to a microaggression is to repair. So taking responsibility for saying, what you can. So maybe you're like, okay, that sounds easy, but what does that look like? I need a script. This PowerPoint's not going to provide you a script, but it will provide you some guidance, right? So I want you to look at it as intention versus impact. So again, acknowledge your bias, seek the feedback. I call it the assist, right? Say you're sorry, impact, not intent. I'm going to highlight that even more and say thank you. Because really focusing on the impact of the comment rather than the intent really allows for that reparative mode in the relationship. It kind of Nadal in 2014 found that it actually strengthens the therapeutic alliance when we're able to acknowledge just the bias in the room, seek that feedback, say you're sorry. So I'll give you an example of what you can say, right, from the last two slides. Let's say there's a microaggression that happened, or you notice a microaggression, right? Sometimes it's important to say, you know what, ask the question of, again, what did you just say? Or ouch. Even just saying something like ouch or oops. If you're one who said something, you say, oops, that sounded oh, I acknowledge, like, excuse my ignorance. I noticed that you kind of flinched at that. And the client may be like, yeah, that kind of hurt. And you're like, okay, well, I thank you. My intention was to share share a little bit about this, but I can understand the impact it has as a negative impact. That wasn't my intention, and I just want to say I'm sorry, or say, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for your feedback, because feedback is a gift, whether you can take it or not. But again, if a client comes to you, or you notice or acknowledge your bias, right? Seek the feedback. I recognize that we're in a society where there's pro-Black, anti-white bias, right? Based on history, based on anything like that, or pro folks who are, there's a thing about fat shaming, right? So we're always like more body positive. Even though there's body positivity, there's also that toxicity. So sometimes it could be like, even in your lobby, if you find that there's room, there's chairs that are um, not of size for folks of all different bodies types, and then you get a feedback from that. That's an opportunity to say, oh man, yeah, let me check my bias. I have, based on how I grew up in society, I have this kind of bias, unconscious belief that all folks should fit this certain body type. And so now and then maybe I made an unintentional comment, or the environment kind of gave a microaggression. I want to be able to lower my defenses, acknowledge that bias, ask the person, I'm sorry, and then impact. And then so I can focus on the impact and not the intent, say thank you. But sometimes it may happen, like if you have to be the bystander, if you've noticed something, notice someone taking it's not you that has a microaggression, but you notice that there was a microaggression happen. That's gonna be important for you to recognize, like, okay, what can I do in this moment? And sometimes it's just checking in with the person, saying, not going into rescue, but just going in and checking and saying, hey, how are you doing? I noticed that this happened. I wonder how you feel. What would you like me to do? Versus, or if you want to take it kind of more directive, you say, I noticed that you said this comment, and I just want to make sure I heard you. What did you just say? Just forcing a person just by asking them, what did you just say? Or like, hey, can you repeat that? I'm confused. Allows a person to say it out loud, right? That kind of breaks that. And then you're able to kind of go on that and say, I heard you say this. I know your intent was this, was to share knowledge, but here's the negative impact, right? And even go a step further and say something like, I noticed that sometimes in the past I would say something like that, but when I learned about this, it made me feel this way. That can help. I know those are vague, but I think it's important. Again, we lean into the curiosity of microaggression. Let's lean into more curiosity about the microvalidation, right? Specific examples are helpful, but I think just kind of turning in and thinking about how can I provide the antidote to microaggression, which is the validation. Because there's healing power in making amends. Again, we're in the room. This is a room at Resolve Counseling, where if you're sitting on that brown leather couch and your client's across the room and you want to kind of create a supportive, affirming environment, these are ways you can do that with the microvalidation. But I have to say this. It is not an easy fix, not an easy fix solution. Because there's small positive actions that encourage or affirm others, this is not a quick fix antidote. But it is an opportunity to kind of be intentional about how we show up in the space. And for folks on the call, I can imagine that, there's already skills in active listening, right? Being able to recognize and validate experiences. So this is already something we're kind of primed and ready to do, especially if you're in a helping role, because there's power in being able to listen and to sit with the emotion of others. And even after there's been a rupture, and the rupture will look like a microaggression. Because when we are able to affirm that emotional reaction through that verbal acknowledgement, I heard, ouch, oops, yikes, Like, so something that was said, the intention behind it was this, unintentional or intentional, and yet the impact was this, was negative. I affirm that your reaction is valid. I affirm that I will acknowledge and engage and actively seek to understand versus to be understood, and recognizing that person's invalidating experience. Because again, all these um, thousand mosquito bites, even I'll go as further and say 1,000 paper cuts that microaggressions feel like, can be wearing and tough and hard. And so in the space that you're in with this client, it's so imperative that we continue to give them validation by providing active listening, recognizing their feelings, and affirming those emotional responses. And even afterwards, if you witness it and share it with someone, or they talk about having a microaggression in a workplace or in a family, that's the place to really kind of get positive actions there. Because there's 5 key benefits of microvalidations. Excuse me. According to the New York Times article I found in 2020, imagine, again, this is around the time that there was like increased media coverage, right? The death of George Floyd, so many social and political injustices that was happening at the time that people were just trying to grasp and understand, how can I be a sense of source of healing and not a source of pain for certain groups of folks? And so this article came out and said, here's some 5 things you can do. And I kind of like, especially in the workplace, it was kind of more business, but I really wanted to tailor it to us as clinicians. The first one is to acknowledge presence, right? Acknowledge the presence of someone in the room, right? Not calling them out, but being able to say, like, we're all here, you know, and all here together, working together. So acknowledging in the room. Even saying something like, I like to do in my profession, especially if there's something like different for me and the client, you know, introducing myself in the first session, kind of sharing like who I am. I call it locating yourself, right? Locating your identity. Hi, I'm Angela Floyd Fletcher. I'm a licensed mental therapist. I personalize in relationships. I also look at the family system. You know, I come from a family of interracial marriage. My mother of 2 biracial children, as well as kind of living in a community out in Blue Springs, Missouri, which is largely conservative, as well as kind of on the Missouri side, right? So already I just told you a couple things from group membership that I'm a part of, or that I'm aware that I live in. And then I also know that we may have difference in kind of perspectives, but I want to validate your identity, right? Validate my identity by starting off with myself. I said happily married to a first responder, right, in the Blue Springs area, Lee Summit area. And I think it's important that, you know, sometimes people feel different, have different feelings about that, you know, and I want to acknowledge that, you know, being able to, the last 3 steps too is very important, that when the client comes to you, again, you can start their process with them, but then so it can make it helpful for the client to feel like they can be fully seen, especially diverse clients. Because you can voice your appreciation for the client's contributions. I know this is really hard and difficult to even come and talk, you know, knowing that there's barriers and stigmas around coming and seeking help. So I appreciate you taking the opportunity, holding other clinicians to higher standards, right? And the ethical responsibility that we're all side out, the code of ethics changing every couple of years. Being able to hold others to that. That means also calling them out, you know? I recognize that there's something that there was an ouch comment that made. I'm not sure what you mean by that. Tell me more. Leaning into that curiosity. Tell me more about what you just said. Can you tell me a little bit about what you meant by that? Right? And if you're in a leadership if you're you know, affirming leadership potential and status for the client, I look at that like more of affirming advocacy, self-advocacy. You know, we all have a right, everyone has a right to be respectful. We all have a responsibility to be respected, right? So we want to be able to respect others as well as we have a responsibility to be respectful. And so that's meaning, you know, providing those micro validations and these 5 steps are helpful. So with that being said, as we're getting near to the end of the conversation, you know, the 5 key takeaways I want you to get from this is this: understanding what microaggressions are as well as what micro validations are. As you can see here, the first is, again, microaggressions are kind of these brief everyday exchanges that can be unintentional or automatic, right? That send negative messages to individuals of their groups. So it could be by gender, it could be race, could be class, everything like that, right? And so knowing that there is certain groups who experience more of those mosquito bites, more of those paper cuts, it's imperative and our ethical responsibility to kind of provide small, intentional, positive actions that encourage or affirm others. The power of listening, right? Healing amends, understanding that there is a rupture and putting it on us, offering and extending that olive branch first as an invitation to say, I'm sorry. I understand what my intention was, but I can understand by body language, right? There was a shift in energy because that wasn't my intention, but I want to be the first to acknowledge that. When you, especially when you've been accused, right? Our first line of defense is to be defensive. Release that, release the need to be defensive, right? Recognize, like, what do I need in this moment? Leaning to the curiosity, right? And then last but not least, I specifically talk about the National Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics. I say social workers, but again, some of our code of ethics doesn't, as I said in the slide before, a couple of slides ago, that there wasn't like blatant language that talked about here's what you do in a microaggression. But I think this is a great example for the National Association of Social Workers. It is respectfully observe and educate. Educate, educate, educate. Even just being on this call, educating yourself really helps, right? To share the knowledge. So because, even if you're not the one giving the microaggression, if you bear witness to it, I think it's important to kind of step in there, right? Be productive. And then last but not least, if you have to, when you have to apologize about a microaggression, it's so critical to focus on the intention. Oh, sorry, I apologize. On the impact, not the intention. So the impact of the comment, that's healing, right? Recognizing that there is a potentially negative, harmful, hurtful impact of that, regardless of your intention, can help a client feel validated. And so with that being said, I want to say thank you so much for taking the opportunity to really listen to this as part of the CARE4U2 conference in 2023. Again, my name is Ashley Floyd Fletcher. I work over at the Resolve Counseling Wellness Office. If you have any questions, comments, thoughts, feelings, hey, you kind of want to consult as it relates to diversity, equity, inclusion, go ahead and email me at ashley@kcresolve.com. And then here's our phone number. And I look forward to hearing from you. And thank you so much. Here's some resources as well.